Happy and Healthy, a series to help you learn about available resources.
Welcome to Happy and Healthy, a series aimed at helping older adults, seniors, their families learn more about the resources available to them. Today we're going to be talking about dealing with loss, a topic pretty familiar to most seniors. And fortunately we have with us today Sheryle Baker from the Life Center, the director of the Life Center. Welcome. So glad you could be here, Sheryle. Mm-hmm. Tammy Alsing, who is the bereavement manager at LifePath Hospice, and Medina Allgrove, who is the director of professional relations at LifePath Hospice. Thanks so much to all of you for being here today. And to open, let's just explain to everybody about what your services are, the history of your agency, and so forth. Could you start, Sheryle?
Sure. Life Center started in 1981 as a grief and bereavement center, and it really started out with 4 children dealing with cancer. And Dr. Martin Cohen, who is still a wonderful clinical psychologist in the community, and Dr. Marilyn Gatlin began the center and started it as a supportive way of helping children who were dealing with the losses of cancer and possibly the losses of not just functioning but death, dealing with death, and one of them that occurred, and their families. And that's really the start of the Life Center. And then I came on in 1983, so it's been about 28 years for me as, I would say, the director and licensed mental health counselor. And the programs have gone from working with illness and also death to the kind of sudden death situations. And we've become very specific because of a grant that we have for victims of crime. And we received that grant in 1999, and that works with people who are dealing with family situations from a murder, a suicide loss, an illness, or an accident. And the specifics of that program are really about helping people through the trauma phases of that, as well as, you know, the whole range of what grief can be. And grief from the reactionary physical body reactions to the emotions and the sadness that continues through life and the readjustment that people go through. And so that process continues at the Life Center. We've served probably somewhere over 65,000 people working as a service that has been a free service for most of these years. We work by donation at this point still. And we have a staff of 1 full-time person, that's me, and all volunteers. We do a lot of supervision and training for graduate people from the different universities in the area, and many of those people have gone on to do wonderful work in the community as clinical social workers and mental health counselors. So the majority of the people that we see is a little different than hospice at this point in the sense of the sudden death situations.
And there must be some differences in how they need to be cared for as others might.
Yes.
And there must be some similarities too, but
yeah.
I want to hear more about that
Sure.
in a minute. Tammy, how about LifePath Hospice?
I'm the social service manager at LifePath Hospice, so, and I believe Medina is going to talk a little bit more about hospice in general, programs and services, but my role primarily at hospice is oversighting the grief services program. While it might be anticipatory grief and helping to support that through directing our social workers and counselors that are a part of an interdisciplinary team while there is a patient and family being cared for, through continuity of services to following the death and providing those grief support services to the family on an ongoing basis up to a year or longer following the death of their loved one.
Fantastic. Medina?
My role at LifePath Hospice is to work with the community in general as well as the professional community on educating them about what hospice services are. Hospice, LifePath Hospice has been in Hillsborough County for almost 30 years now. It was started.
Is that one of the first or second hospices in the country or something? You don't remember?
I don't
okay,
remember.
I think it is. Okay.
But I know we've been in existence for 30 years
Yeah.
when there was a recognized need within the community for a way to work with family members as well as patients on end-of-life issues. What makes us a little bit different is that we have the ability to work with families from anywhere from a year to 6 months that have been given a diagnosis of a life-limiting illness. So those family members are able to work with us a little bit longer on how to deal with that grief at the very, very end. So that's what we're about here at LifePath.
Your services, unlike you're doing by donation, unlike the services that they provide at the Life Center, are covered, are they not? Under
for the most part, they
some
are.
of our laws?
They are covered for the most part through either private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, but at LifePath, should they not have any coverage whatsoever, an individual that comes to us, we do not deny them services. We provide services for any and all as long as they are asking us for help.
So our big issue that we're talking about today is, dealing with loss. We've talked about a lot of subjects around this in some of our other programming, and how do you differently approach this, I'm sure, but Sheryle, can you talk about how you deal with this subject, or how people can deal with it that'll make it somewhat rewarding for them rather than as terrible as it initially seems?
Well, I think death is always a very difficult subject to talk about. And I remember that when my teacher, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, began working in 1970s and 80s, and it still continues to be. So there's no wonderful way to package, in the sense of what happens when a loved one dies. In the way that we see it is that normal people who have extraordinary circumstance of someone who doesn't come home that night, or their loved one was taking a trip and they've never heard from them since. So there is that great mystery of what happened. And it's different than a slower process or anticipatory loss and going through the ability to deal with some of the physical changes and physical losses that go into the process towards dying. And in our situation, there isn't that time. There's no time to say goodbye. There's just the shock of this can't be happening. And that creates tremendous sense of confusion and loss of control. And I think that that's one of the differences between dealing with an illness into a dying situation and a sudden death. And so that's, a lot, what we're working with is the aftermath, and what I would call is the leftovers, in a way, of what happens after it's a newspaper article or a media piece on the television that night that that family's child was killed. And they end up coming in to see us 3 days, 3 weeks later, whatever that would be, to begin to sort out from the shock of it. The sense of the denial is not in the same way, although it goes in and out of denial for quite a while, that people are still not ready to land on it. And they still feel like, oh, they're going to come around the corner, or they'll be home for dinner at 6 o'clock after school. Whatever the situation is, it's still the unreality that we deal with for a long time. And there's no set time limit. I've done this work for 30 years, and looking at people that it would be nice, ideally, that you go through the stages of acknowledging the loss and dealing with some of the pain, adjusting to that loss, and then the segue into life differently and looking for what peace people can find from it, or what they've learned, what they want to share with other people. I think that's some of the ways that if we could say what is the outcome or the goals that people are looking for here. How do I go on adjusting differently? A new set of what was normal is no longer normal, and there is that whole adjustment period that people go through from that control.
When dealing with this, are they in groups or individual counseling?
Either or both.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They can
Either
do
or
both
both.
things if they want, or
yeah,
if they
we
don't
offer,
like the whole group thing, they can
We offer, some people say, I don't want to sit in front of other people that are grieving and expressing their suffering. That's too much for me to take in. Other people will say, I very much appreciate talking to someone else who's gone through this type of death.
Right.
So that they have a sense of some not feeling so isolated with it.
Are you still running groups like for particular groups like the parents group
Yes, we
versus
do.
if you were a sister, brother, sibling, friend of someone that,
Yes.
that this occurred with?
Yeah, we have a group for parents, we have a group specific for homicide loss, we have specific groups for teenagers, and similar to hospice in that way for children and teenagers separately. And sometimes we just do family sessions. We've been doing more of those recently because it's really important that the families actually learn a lot in just sitting together and listening to their teenager who hasn't wanted to speak about it at all. Somehow they find that some question or some way that they can share with their parent, and the mom goes, I didn't know you felt that way.
Right.
So
teenagers are a strange breed, and I'd like to talk to you more about
Sure.
that, but I don't want to leave
Sure.
Tammy out of this. So
She's good at
Tammy,
it.
anticipatory, which hospice can be more involved in simply because people come before there is a death, correct?
Absolutely.
And when you talk about what goes on with that.
Well, as Medina mentioned, our hospice can accept patients and families into the hospice program a year to 6 months when they've been given a diagnosis of a life-limiting condition. And we encourage that. While that's hard for families, I think, to make that step, there's just so many resources that can support the family, because unlike a sudden death, as Sheryle had mentioned, it's the opportunity to finish unfinished business, to say goodbye, to begin to approach death with support, with compassion, and to have a team of professionals helping with that, all the while still very scary and difficult. And it's almost a hierarchy of needs, because when our patients and families come into the hospice program, they're frightened, they're scared, they're learning a new language. The diagnosis maybe had been very, very recent. So they're trying to understand what that means. Many sometimes still aren't open to hearing what that fully means. So there's a window of opportunity that our staff really look for to approach and begin to answer questions that they might have. And ideally, they'll accept the services of our social workers and our counselors to assist them in talking about some of those emotions, those questions that they might have about their loved one approaching death. And we find that that is an opportunity because it does begin the grief process early. Anticipatory grief can help someone in the grief journey, and we see the difference because oftentimes in our society still today, we're getting very late referrals to hospice, and when they come to us with just a day or two or sometimes hours, it's as though they're hitting them, the whole family is impacted by a sudden death. They're not prepared. They hadn't had that time to understand and to absorb the loss and the meaning of that gradually. So it does to them feel like a sudden death. So we know that complicates the grief process tremendously.
So many people are afraid of just even the word hospice. Oh dear,
Yes.
that means I'm going
Means
to
the
die.
end.
And that's what you're talking about. I'm coming into the program when we're down to a week of life left.
Yes.
And that's your job, isn't it, Medina, to try to get the doctors to make referrals sooner than later, and the nurses and people to keep an eye out on this?
Right, exactly. I mean, if we could, by the time what Tammy was talking about, when we get families at the last week to the last hours, they are completely overwhelmed. They're exhausted from everything that they have had to go through. And we hear oftentimes, oh, I wish I had just known about this sooner. And that's part of what my team and I do, is try to get out there and educate those physicians and educate the community, because we're finding that more and more people will go to their physician and say, I want to know about this. Or pick the phone up and just call us and say, hey, what do you think? Do you think they qualify? Is this something that my mom, my dad, or my brother or my sister should be looking at? So that's...
I think a lot of people don't understand some of the actual specifics of what goes on. So I don't know if you can touch on that, but you're talking not only about dealing with the family, but the person who actually got the diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Right, and they're dealing with loss. And then the family's going to deal with loss, all those participants and the people around them and everything. And perhaps they don't understand that they'll get visits and volunteers come. Maybe you'd explain all of that.
Well, you started to mention that people are afraid of the word hospice. And my husband's in the medical field, and I asked him one day, I said, well, how do you, when you know someone's ready for hospice, how do you describe it to him? And he said that he talks about all those services, all the things that hospice can help with before he even mentions the hospice word. Because sometimes I think people stop listening if they've had a fear or preconceived idea of what it is. So to talk about the nursing care and the pain management, we have experts who know how to respond to pain and difficult pain so that they can begin to approach the emotions. Just daily care, assisting with changes in mobility and their functioning level. Support from a care team that includes a chaplain if there are spiritual issues, the social worker, the hospice aide, the nurse, the physician, a volunteer for companionship. The patient oftentimes will understand that those services are available and accept them as they go through, as they journey through. Sometimes, again, still very frightening, and they may accept the hospice aide to come in, and it may be the hospice aide that the patient tells their fears, their worries, and their concerns to. It's a very intimate level of care. It's natural that they would begin to open up. And then it's up to the hospice aide then to take that to the team and to share those needs that the patient might be expressing so that the whole team can respond in their special way to the patient and the family. And then, of course, every member of the family will be coping and dealing with the changes in the patient's condition and the associated grief with acknowledging end of life approaching.
Did you want to add something to that, Medina, in terms of like her husband, how does he approach it? And how do you talk to doctors about how they can approach it? Because they may also have a hard time with it. I mean, I don't see them as probably any different than anybody else, right?
Right, they're not. They tend to, they have a very difficult time, and that's usually when they call us in. And they will actually, we've been able in the last several months, been able to go in and actually visit with and speak with patients within a physician's office, because a physician, they feel comfortable enough of talking about diagnosis, but when they were scared it would become a little bit too emotional. They actually pull my team in to come in and talk to the family members. What we tell physicians is to use us. Let us be that voice for you. Let us talk to that family, and let us help you help that family member.
For all of you, you touched for a minute on the hospice supplying a chaplain, having a chaplain there, and I know from my experience with Sheryle and my experience with hospice, which I've had, luckily here I find myself had experience with all of you, and could actually comment on that. But I do know that when you said chaplain, that what some people don't understand is whose religion are you following with this, or what spiritual, and I'm going to take it to you, Sheryle, because I do know a little bit about what you do, and I do know what you guys do, but let's let the viewers know.
We certainly provide the care for non-denominationally, that we respect everybody's religion, and if people are not wanting to talk about their religion or feel like they've had to shy away from their religious beliefs because of the tragedy that's occurred in their lives, we also explore that with them. So it's really about if they want to explore the spiritual aspects of their living and the death afterwards. A lot of our folks come in and they've had a religious upbringing, and something shifts either deeper into that religion or away from it because of some of the conflict that goes on and the struggle that goes on in the experience when people will say, a sense of not feeling that they prayed enough, and why wasn't their child saved, or why, what did God?
What did they do wrong?
What did they do wrong?
Why
Punishment.
do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
What was his
and
name?
I think
Who
it's
wrote that?
Groman. wasn't it? Or Kushner.
Kushner.
Or
Fabulous
Kushner.
book.
Yes.
Fabulous book.
Yes, yes.
Back when, but
You know, so the sense of punishment that goes with a lot of the territory, people experience that, and I think it's a wonderful way to start with some of the feelings that they have, and that goes back to the bargaining aspect of grief anyway, that if only, or what if, or could have
if I'm
done
really,
something
really good,
different.
could this person not die?
Or
Right.
what did I do
Something
in my
like that.
past that, you know, that could have created this tragedy now? And I think those are really normal questions that we as human beings ask. You know, something happens to us, we think, why? And there's no answer for the why, but I think it's a normal part of grieving to go through that shuttling back between my head knows the fact, my heart won't accept it.
About the religious question with regard to hospice.
Our chaplains at hospice are versed in all religions, all faiths and spiritual backgrounds, so they meet the family where they are and are invited in, if you will. It is a service that is there and available should a family desire it, and it depends on the family and their path. They may have a very strong connection in their religious congregation, their faith, and decline our chaplains. Or they may have such a connection, and as Sheryle mentioned, faith crisis or spiritual crisis might be what they're struggling with. And so sometimes they pull away from their own faith and spirituality and turn to pondering other questions and support. So in a very non-judgmental way, supportive way, our chaplains can support. And sometimes for the patient, they'll have said that they really hadn't had an attachment to a particular religion or faith or spirituality, but in the face of approaching death, they are pondering life.
Returning to a religion.
To something to give them strength or to maybe answer some questions that they have. So our chaplains are available for that, in addition to help to provide a commemoration and memorial services as well for the family.
Dina, you speak to different, besides the doctors and the other professional community, do you speak to people in the religious world, the clergy and so forth?
Yes, we do. We actually have relationships with all the churches here in the community as well. We reach out to their outreach ministers as well as the main pastors within those congregations.
Are they known to bring hospice in as well? As like the doctors do, like as you mentioned, doctor calling you in and saying, come on down and talk to these folks?
They have been very, very open in asking us to come in to talk to their members as far as what hospice actually is. You know, how can that benefit a family member? What other services do we have within a hospice? Potentially the volunteer information they're always interested in and how they can help us as well. The other organizations that we reach out to are also other care partners like your assisted living facilities as well.
Oh, okay.
Because we do take care of individuals within those other types of settings. And they've been very open as far as asking questions and how can we help them better.
You just mentioned working with adult living facility, adult living facilities, right?
Right.
Okay. And in those, when they're having to deal with someone who is a resident of their facility, what do they do? Do they have to call hospice in immediately, or do they provide any other services themselves? Or they have to go outside for those?
Well, they actually will call, if they have a patient or a resident within that facility. Number one, hospice takes care of patients in a home setting, no matter where that home setting may be. And assisted living is a home setting for us.
Oh, this
and
is
for that
true.
patient.
We didn't mention that they don't always stay at home.
Right.
So do you want to, where are they? Sometimes they're in an adult living facility. They may be in the hospital themselves.
Correct.
Do you still have like a particular, I remember years ago, hospice had a room at Moffitt, or I don't know if you still do those kinds of things, that was devoted to hospice.
We actually have 2 hospice houses within the county. We also have relationships with hospitals within the community that have dedicated wings or dedicated areas that we work with, that are hospice patients, and they work with us within those hospitals. The one thing that Tammy was talking about a while ago was as far as dealing with grief. when we work with our assisted living facilities, the one thing we do offer them as well is we find out that they are like family members to those patients that are enrolled within hospice.
Right.
And they, the grief that, and what we offer them as well as our patients that are at home is the same thing. We do memorial services within those settings. We work with their staff on dealing with the loss, of that individual. And as well as dealing with that the life-limiting side of it once that their resident, maybe that potentially had been with them for many, many years, has been given that type of diagnosis. We work with them on that journey as well.
So the employees need help too.
Right, exactly.
They really do.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk more about this subject. Please stay tuned. We're going to take a break right now. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Patty, I boldly went to socialsecurity.gov, and it's out of this world.
SocialSecurity.gov is a website for everybody.
Even teenagers?
Absolutely. Young people can help their grandparents with retiring online or getting extra help with their Medicare prescription drug costs.
So really, everyone.
There you go.
We're back on with Happy and Healthy, talking today about loss, how to deal with that. I'm Louise Thompson, from the Executive Director from Tampa Bay Community Network, where we hope you'll all come and take a tour and see our facility and maybe get some productions on our channels, which are your channels. And with us again are Sheryle Baker from the Life Center, Tammy Alsing from LifePath Hospice, and Medina Allgrove from LifePath Hospice. Let's talk about the children for a minute. Children are dealing with seniors, the loss of their grandparents. I think I don't know if it's more significant in Florida than anywhere where our population's a little bit older, but we certainly have a lot of kids around. And all of you provide services to children. I'm going to go with you, Tammy, first, because you have a camp particularly for them, right?
We do. We have an annual children's camp. It's called Camp Circle of Love every year in the spring. This year it'll be in April. And it's for children as young as 6 and as old as 17 years old who've experienced the loss of a loved one. And they do not have to have been cared for by the hospice program to participate. It really helps the children to come together, to be with their peers in age-appropriate setting, groups, as well as having fun and doing what kids are born to do, is to play and be in nature and to still have fun and know that even in the face of loss, life still has a lot to offer. And we have targeted groups to be able to openly share their feelings, their emotions. We do a memorial service. Oftentimes children are still left out of attending funerals and memorial services for their loved ones for various different reasons. So we do encourage them to attend, but
we got
still.
too politically correct, is just the way I see it. I'm not sure that was the right thing to do.
It's unfortunate
Yeah,
because
I think
children,
it really is. It really is.
it's a part of the healing process. And so for many of them who come to our camp, and we take about 120 kids every year.
How long is it?
It's a weekend from Friday afternoon through Sunday afternoon.
And it's local?
Local.
Okay.
In Brooksville. Pretty local.
Not too far away. You have programs for children too, don't you?
We do, and it brings up, we see a very large proportion of grandparents that are raising children. And that's in the field.
I did a show on that. I can't believe it.
In the field
I just
that
absolutely cannot believe the number of people in our county, in our community, probably in the state, and maybe, who knows, all across the country, that our grandparents are raising even little kids, and they're even older than I am, which is really,
it's
think
a
about it,
very
it's tremendous.
amazing story.
Yeah.
And the story is that, you know, they've raised their children and their adult child dies of whatever reason, and if they come in the Life Center, generally it's because of a sudden accident or a victim of a crime situation. And when that occurs, those adult grandparents, or just single grandparent often, are raising then the children, and sometimes it's 4 or 5 children in a family, and they're starting all over again. And their parental skills have been a little rusty, and they have to really kind of regroup and find some support to be parents. And most of them wonderfully adjust, but it doesn't give them time to deal with their grief often, because they're thrown into the situation of having to wake the kids up and get ready for school and meal planning and all of those things. And then they realize that there is grief that's going on very uniquely with each family member, each child, and that often the communication is blunted at times. You know, it doesn't have an ability to really know what's going on and who can the kids turn to, because everybody's so busy with the life skills that are going on. So in terms of the audience, and we see a lot of folks 50 and older that are raising 3, 4, 5, 10-year-old and teenagers.
And what happens with those children when they've lost maybe a parent and then a grandparent who became their parent? Doesn't that happen?
Absolutely can happen. You know, some of them have to go back to the systems if there's no parent or guardian to take care of them. And in the situation of a single grandparent who's caring for the kids, the support is needed for that grandparent, but also really as the caregiver and also the receiver of a lot of the feelings and the reactions and how to help the children cope. And that's, I know, what hospice does, and we do that. Individually, we provide the individual counseling sessions, family sessions, excuse me, family sessions, and as well as groups that are expressive arts groups. So we do play therapy, a lot of non-threatening, often symbolic language, because a lot of the kids don't want to talk. They don't want to talk about their loss. They don't want to say words about it. They don't have words for some of the feelings that they have. And so the art programs that we do and other community programs do that also is just a very helpful way to kind of have them approach it from a non-threatening base, from play, you know, a way to play therapy.
I mentioned earlier that I did know from something in my own family that teenagers are difficult because they don't know how to react, or they put it off for maybe 3 years, or they have to wait till the dog dies or something to deal with their mother. I mean,
well, it's a different age
why
now.
is that?
Well, and they have Facebook, and they have their social media, and when the parents come in and say they won't talk about the loss of their mom at all, we get the children in the room separately, and I don't know if it's similar for you all, and the kids say, well, I talk to my friends every day, and you can see it, and parents can actually look at it. They're expressing a lot of different feelings and reactions, unabridged, on Facebook. And also, a lot of them have come in and said, I write music, I write poems, they'll bring in poems. You know, we'll do kind of writing classes sometimes on that. So just ways to help them express.
When you're doing the camps, is there a special, and you said from 6 up, so they're 17, so are the teenagers a special situation? I think people should know about that.
We do separate the age groups, so we do have specialized groups for teenagers because it is a very vulnerable time just in general in the developmental cycle for teenagers. And then you add to that a very significant loss of a parent or a grandparent, guardian, or someone. It can be very very vulnerable. We watch for signs of depression, clinical depression, sometimes suicide ideation with the teens. I think they're beginning to abstract the concept of death and dying differently at that age with teenagers, understanding that it is final, that you know, for a young woman I recall being in our children's center, she suddenly realized that her father wasn't going to be there to see her graduate. Her father wasn't going to be there to see her when she walked down the aisle when she got married. So at the moment that he died, all of those things became very real to her. Unlike, you know, her siblings, who were much younger, they had a very different frame of reference. And so their grief, they were grieving as well, just very differently, and not at that very abstract level, you know, that to understand the finality and to look to the future and how the future was going to be different. So her grief was very intense, and she withdrew quite a bit, and it took some time to have her approach. She was, as Sheryle mentioned, approached her friends first. That was her social outlet, and how she received her support in her family, and not through other family members. But that was difficult for the family to understand that.
So is it common that maybe not just teenagers, but even others delay for some period of time before they actually need the help of hospice or Life Center?
I think it just depends on the person, the family. Some people come in the next day. We've had them as soon as the next day after a tragedy. And other people, it might be months, it might even be years. And we had a lady once, I remember, came in 10 years after the death of her son. And if you saw her in this room, you would think it was yesterday, because she was now ready to deal with grief in a way that she never got to. She had to raise her family, she had to go on with living, she went back to school, she had to have a job at the same time, and the grief got postponed. But it, you know, it has its own timing, and that's why research might say the first 2 years are where you see the most active grieving aspect of people in mourning. But it can go on. It just depends on the person's life.
Is it more common for that delay to occur in the younger population? As I had thought originally when I mentioned the teenager, that a social worker had told me that in this circumstance I brought up, which was a family member, a teenager, who was actually acting out crazy at the funeral. Like, she explained to me that sometimes a teenager will put it off until some other event occurs because they don't have the coping skills to deal with it at that moment. Is that common or not so much?
I really see that teens expressed it in their own way, in their own time, and they use their peers. So
more than they use other kinds of...
Yeah, often. You know, some of them will go for counseling, and some of them really do want to talk about it. So it depends on the kids.
I find the same thing, and typically within hospice, I see the adults delaying more than the children. The children that we work with generally are even the teenagers, if they come to us, sometimes the parents drag them kicking and screaming because they don't know what else to do. And when they get there, the children find the bond, they find their common age group, and they realize that, okay, I'm not just going to be sitting face to face with a counselor and having to talk and bare my soul. I'm going to be with my peers, and they do open up. But you would ask the question about do they delay, and particularly we see after a hospice loss sometimes we follow up on the grief services side, offer support, whether that be individual or group. And a lot of the times they are thankful of the hospice services. They say they couldn't have gone through that journey without hospice, but they do often decline right away the grief services. And it wouldn't be uncommon for a few months later, 6 months later, maybe not until the first anniversary of the death, or really any of the firsts that we see where there would be some awakening of perhaps the grief that might have been a bit of in a numbing phase, where there's a holiday, a birthday, or something that awakens them to the reality that their life has changed, that their loved one is no longer physically present. And that's when they're likely to call back in. So we do try to remind our families that we work with that even if at the time of death they don't find they need grief services, that it's never too late. And sometimes they'll call back in and they'll go, you know, why was, you know, this is now going on to the second year, and why is this feeling like it's the hardest now? That time should have, you know, gone by, you know, I should be doing better, all of the shoulds. Well, and as Sheryle mentioned, the delay can be...
people around you do it too, where
yes,
they say, aren't you over that yet?
They do.
I mean, that happened last year. What's your problem?
Right,
I mean,
putting people on a time frame.
Yeah,
Family
which
members
they
do
can't
that.
be. You know, they just, if they're still crying about it or upset, sometimes some people will be not understanding about it at all, I believe.
And my answer often is when people come in and say, you know, with those things, I was blindsided by that comment that somebody had said, aren't you over it yet? Often the statement is, you know, you can let them know they're not walking in your shoes.
Right.
So there's no way that they can know what this loss means to you, and the emptiness and the longing and yearning that goes on off and on in the mourning process.
Yeah, because somebody mentioned that, you know, couples that are married a very long time may have a particular, I guess, slant on it than other people do.
Yes, because I think as part of the grief process is to begin to adjust to the life without the loved one. And for 30, 40, 50 plus years, they've lived a life together in unison and almost have become one. So then in death, they feel lost. They're struggling to redefine themselves because they had been defined as a couple, and many struggle with that. And we do encourage them to seek the grief services. Perhaps a support group can help with that too.
And speaking of that, let's go into the tips, and I know you mentioned a few of them just while you're answering other questions. And that is maybe you find a creative expression, or go to your friends, or go to Facebook, or express yourselves in some ways. But I don't, Medina, we haven't heard from you yet, and I'm sure that even doctors have, and professional people have grief they're dealing with too. But is there a good list of tips if I'm watching the show and I'm just have dealt with, a pretty good loss to me, somebody close to me and everything, that you would say, if I didn't even come into your program, I mean, you're saying you're available, I can come there to either of these programs, but let's say I don't want to do that because I'm in a particular cultural group that doesn't believe in that, or I'm 89 years old and we can't go for counseling because that's not part of our lives, or whatever it is, because that happens, correct? People who are not raised to think they should go out for help, they should be able to do it themselves. And so could you relay some of those tips like you just mentioned? I mean, this is not just teenagers that may go, or young people that do artsy things to get out their energy. Are there is there a nice little list of try this and try that and try the other thing?
Well, if you're asking me at the moment, I think there's, for a lot of people that can't come into our centers, or sometimes I know the hospice does home visitation and we do not. However, by phone, sometimes it's just the really compassionate listening that they find one person, whether that's a counselor or a neighbor or someone that can hear them and in a way help them make sense of some of the things that they have not yet expressed. And part of it is not everybody wants to talk about their loss, and so we encourage people to do some journaling and also to find some of the books are helpful. You mentioned Kushner's book. There are some for I Never Got to Say Goodbye for people with sudden death. Kubler-Ross's book on grief and grieving was a book that was one of her later ones on grief. So for some people it's trying to find some outreach to help them with the alienation that they might feel in their loss. And if you don't have a buddy to share that with or someone, I think it's an internal journey, and it can be there through writing some of their thoughts, or just the way that they sort that out in their own sense. Sometimes we make memory books, or we encourage them to take their photographs and create a story of the life, not just of the death.
Yeah.
So that's a really important piece, because there's a whole life here, and there's just this ending which everybody is focused on. But the gift is that they have that opportunity to go back in time and recreate that story of that person's life. And it gives them meaning. And whatever would give a person meaning and a sense of readjusting and coming back to their life in a different way. And we mentioned widows, and the identity is changed. That they don't have that identity, or they don't have that oneness of a connection, and they feel like I've lost a part of myself. And I think that has truth to it. And so how do you go on living when a loved one dies? And that's a book by Therese Rando that's also very helpful.
Because your identity is wrapped up in it. With
Yes,
that
it is.
thing, I'm a wife, not a widow.
Or
I've been a wife
I didn't
for
pay
this
the
period
bills,
of
or
time.
I didn't drive. He did the driving. What do you do now? Those are how do we learn some new skills after the heaviness of the grief begins to lift?
Just triggering a memory. I was at a car wash once years ago, and I was sitting on the bench waiting for my car to be done, and this woman sat down next to me and didn't even notice that she was there until she said, "Don't you hate car washes?" And I said, "Gee, I don't know, I never thought about it." She said, "Well, there's all these decisions to make. Do you get the $29.95 or the $14.95? And then there's this. Do you do the tires, or you leave them alone? What do you do with all that?" And I said, "Yeah, I suppose you're right. I just pick the most expensive thing and just do that, figuring it'll be really clean." And then when she kept talking, and she said, "My husband used to take care of the car. He knew when to rotate the tires. He knew what to do with this and this and this."
Yes.
and he died. And so she hated car washes. It wasn't the car wash. It was that now she had to assume some things that she really counted on him for, to do. And all I could say was, I think you'll get it after a while. You'll know all these things, and there's people around that'll help you. But I found that really just triggered that memory for me. I'm like, yeah, that's right. It's an interesting thing. So how about some tips from Tammy and Medina?
Well, I think, with hospice, following the loss, there's a sense of almost shutting down. So in addition to all the things that Sheryle mentioned that are helpful, I think the basics of living and breathing and eating and sleeping and taking care of oneself physically, mentally, emotionally, they forget how to do that, forgetting to eat, forgetting to take their medicine. There's so much energy consumed by the emotions of grief. Regular routine things are challenged. So keeping balance, and I think about children and how children grieve. They're so innately hardwired to balance grief and to do it spontaneously, and then to do what they need, and then to go out and play in the next 10 or 15 minutes or however long. And adults, we have a tendency to either do none of it, in other words, to discuss what we were talking earlier about delayed grief, so to completely shut down and to not grieve is a choice that individuals make as an adult, or to immerse themselves 100% into grieving, almost to the point where it incapacitates them. And we see both sides of that, and then try to help them to navigate more to the middle. Either way, where they are isn't the best place in terms of the toll that it will take on them physically, mentally, emotionally. To help them pace themselves, to dose themselves, to do a little bit at a time through the methods that Sheryle mentioned. Everybody grieves differently. There's instrumental styles of grieving, those that need to do and to be physical, and you see folks constructing memorials or being a part of active committees and lobbies, Parents Against Drunk Driving. Those are good examples of
Oh my goodness, the woman that started that, I mean,
Yes.
somebody who really took the grief and made
Absolutely.
the world change. I mean,
Absolutely.
we've
Created a
the
meaning.
entire,
Total.
You guys are probably too young to remember when, drinking and partying were totally accepted, and nobody thought they had too much to drink to drive. I mean, they never thought about it, and she made a whole movement happen just because she lost her child. I mean,
Yes.
just an amazing, the inventor of MAD, and I've lost her name, I'm sorry to say, but tremendous, took something and made something tremendous out of it, something that was really sad, just changed the entire universe. Medina, can you add to any of this?
I have to agree with Tammy and that, and Sheryle, and that everybody grieves very, very differently. It's very, very personal in the way that you express your loss. What I would say, and one tip that I would have, is to make sure that you have someone, that you have either that significant other or that partner to help you, to talk it through, and to know that it's okay to talk it through. It's funny that you bring up about the lady in the car wash. When my father passed away several years ago, my mom didn't know how to put gas in a car. So that was one of the very, very first things that my uncle did.
You could break down over something like that.
Oh yeah. She
I mean,
didn't
you
know
could
what
just
to
go
do.
take the bump and then just break down because
Sure.
it's telling you, it's reminding you that he's not here.
Yeah, exactly. And then personally, when my grandmother died several years back, the one thing we did with her prior, when you talk about anticipatory grief, was she was the big matriarch of the family, and she had all these recipes. And what we decided to do as a family was to have her do like a book of her recipes, to where every year, we get together and we talk about it, or we make something out of that book, even years later. But these are things that I would say that they need to find their own way to express it, but to not be afraid to express it, and to find someone that they can share it with.
Somebody who'll let them not live with the elephant in the room or
Right.
whatever.
Exactly.
I remember after my only sibling and younger brother died, that's how I met Sheryle and got some help from her to deal with that the next big event that we should have all been together, his wife, his widow, and his children and my children was the graduation of one of my oldest son. And so we went to a restaurant to celebrate this after the graduation, and I put an extra chair up and just said, you know, he'd have been here, so I'm just going to put this chair up. And his children just got a little unsettled, and then suddenly it was like a good idea. Good, we remembered him. We didn't just like pretend the fact that he wasn't here. You know, I mean, it was just like you're acknowledging with the recipes. It's something I felt I had to do. Wasn't so sure they liked it, but eventually they got over it and it was fine. But I went to see you and you tried something, you referred me to somebody because you weren't at that time, I guess, as certified back in '97. And I see that this EMDR, which I wonder if you could, you know, touch on that and explain it, because it is another method for moving you forward when you feel quite immobilized, as I was when my brother died. And I know it's now being used for post-traumatic stress by the military, approves it and so forth. Could you explain that?
Well, I think when people have a lot of intrusive memories, intrusive thoughts, disturbing thoughts, nightmares and flashbacks, I use it, or I really listen for when is this opportunity there to help a person digest that very traumatic material, so in order that they can grieve. Because a lot of time it just keeps recycling. So EMDR is called eye movement desensitization and reprocess work, and it's a lot of words. And in essence, it's really using some techniques that are bilateral movements that affect both right hemisphere and left hemisphere of the brain, and try to bring a sense of balance and kind of work through those particular triggers that happen, whether it's an anniversary or a siren that they hear, and it gets them right back into that moment. So it's really working with the biological ways that people record those memories and helping them move through some of them in a little different way. It often changes the perspective, or they have an aha moment. They think about the loss differently rather than just stay focused over and over on the horrible situation or the way that the death occurred. And so I've found that in many of the cases when I've worked with people, they've had a different perspective about the loss, and it takes out the sting of the intensity of some of the ways that they have been.
And it works when you don't even know it's working.
Well, yeah.
As was my case.
Because I think it's working with a lot of the negative beliefs and the interpretations that we make immediately following that death, or even before the death, if you're working with it, and you go, oh, I could have done something different. And that creates a whole message inside, I'm not good enough, or I failed at something. And so it's a way of really moving beyond and taking that belief and changing that belief in a way that really is helpful to people in the sense of less intensity. And then their grieving has more of a flow. But I just want to say that even though there are stages, many different kinds of ways of stages of grieving, everybody, as you've said, Medina, go through it in a very unique way. So that some people may have anger, some people may never show anger. Some people are continually feeling depressed and despairing and keep yearning for bringing back the loved one, the old way of normal, and that doesn't quite ever fit anymore. You know, it's like an old shoe that they really have to let go of. And it's an old relationship that they have to let go of. So it's really that people grieve in their own way, and that acceptance is really more of a journey of reconciling and always keeping some different place for that loved one in your heart. And I think that that's where the spirituality comes through, or just the way that a person changes into some acceptance, which is about peace. It's not about, yay, I've got it now, I'm over it. And I don't think you ever get over a death. I think you go through it, and there's pieces of it that come back in life over all of those anniversaries and passages of time that go on with people.
You, I think, I don't know if Life Center does this, but I do know Hospice did, and I just wonder how it works with people who have gotten comfort from your agency. Sometimes want to repay that by becoming volunteers to your agency. And I know there were some rules in place in Hospice long ago about when and how that could happen. I wonder if you could speak to that.
You know, ideally, it's after the first year. If somebody does want to volunteer to be a companion or support to patients and families, Then they go through an interview process, a screening process, just to make sure that the time is right for them and they're not going to be in an extremely vulnerable place. But if it is right for them, it's a perfect opportunity for someone to, having gone through the experience at a personal level, to be able to share and to be patient and present and supportive with family members to go through that, whether that be actually respite care and support or companionship, to read to the patient, to talk to the patient, or whether that be support to the family. But many individuals who've had a hospice experience or not like to be a part of the hospice program in a volunteer way, and many say, oh, I couldn't be the one to support the family, that's too close for me, or I don't think I'm strong enough to do that. And there's lots of other volunteer opportunities in the office, in the thrift store.
Fundraising events.
Fundraising events, absolutely.
Yeah.
We do have volunteers at our children's center as well.
We're running out of time, and so I want to open it up to a minute apiece on anything you think we left out that is really important, or something you want to really emphasize to viewers or the audience that is watching or needs help from this.
I would just say that I think loss is a real part of the human condition of life, and we all go through it, and to find support in a way that helps each person in their own way find a sense of healing. And I think that's really what acceptance might be called, rather than acceptance, it would be healing. Because there's a lot that you learn about yourself in going through the death of a loved one. And I've had experiences of death myself, and I know that it's very different on that side of it, rather than being a professional in it. And that loss really takes a lot of courage and a sense of reaching out sometimes and finding that you live out your own answers often, and sometimes with the support of a helping person, and sometimes you just will find something that brings you peace in a sense that says, yes, it has happened and I am different. And you begin to define yourself differently.
Tammy?
I would say from the hospice mission to encourage individuals, if they are questioning and pondering hospice support for themselves or a family member, to ask those questions, to reach out to Call Hospice, because the anticipatory grief process is so beneficial. To have that time to learn and absorb it over time, that will greatly impact the grief process following. And then just one more tip on in terms of grief and healing, is to filter what well-meaning family, friends, the community might share or tell someone, because everyone always has something to say in a family. I have a friend
and they should only say, I'm sorry, according to Kushner.
Right.
Just repeat that over and over and over and over, and don't say another word because you're going to screw up.
Sometimes it's better not to say anything,
well,
but just
I'm
to be
sorry,
a quiet
it's just
presence,
fine.
right?
It just works every single
and
time.
And oftentimes it's because they're anxious themselves.
Medina, we've got just a few seconds.
I would have to echo what Tammy said. Just if you have anybody who you think might be appropriate or would need help on a journey, just to give hospice a call and let us see how we can help you through this.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And it's so actually comforting to know that you're all there and provide this way of closing out some chapter in our lives. Thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time on Happy and Healthy.
Boldly go to socialsecurity.gov.
If it wasn't so important, would I be wearing pointy ears?